The ballroom of the Meridian Hotel held 400 guests that night, all of them wealthy, all of them watching. Liam Foster was moving carefully between tables when a drunk guest stumbled into his path, and a full glass of red wine arced through the air and landed directly on the ivory gown of Evelyn Carrington. The room went silent for exactly 1 second, then laughter rippled through the crowd. Evelyn reached for the microphone on the podium beside her, turned to face Liam, and let the silence stretch until it became a weapon. "What can a poor waiter teach me?" No one moved to help him. The wine had already soaked into the ivory fabric by the time Liam set the empty tray down on the nearest surface and straightened his jacket. Around him, the 400 guests of the Meridian's annual charity gala stood frozen in that particular way that wealthy people do when they sense blood in the water, not alarmed, but entertained. Camera phones had already appeared. Several people near the front were smiling before Evelyn Carrington had even finished raising the microphone to her lips. She didn't need to raise her voice. The room's acoustics were designed for exactly this sound, traveling cleanly from the podium to every corner, every table, every chandelier-lit face. Evelyn stood in what remained of her ivory gown, red wine bleeding across the left side like a wound, and she looked at Liam the way a person looks at something that has fallen off a shelf and broken. The microphone caught the faint sound of her exhale before she spoke. The laughter that followed her question was soft and controlled, the kind that comes from people who have learned to perform amusement without actually feeling it. Liam stood very still. He was 41 years old and had heard worse in worse places from worse people. But something about the microphone, about the crowd, about the deliberateness of her cruelty made the question land differently. He didn't lower his head. He didn't step back. He looked at Evelyn Carrington directly and kept his voice level enough that the people in the first 3 rows could hear him clearly. Sometimes the people with the least money understand value the most. The laughter stopped. Not gradually, it stopped the way a song stops when someone pulls the power cord from the wall. Evelyn's expression didn't change exactly, but something moved behind her eyes. Something fast and involuntary, the way a person flinches before they've decided whether to be afraid. She recovered in under a second. She turned back to the podium. The gala continued, and the crowd slowly re-engaged with their champagne and their conversations. And within 10 minutes, the whole incident had been quietly filed away as an amusing footnote to an otherwise successful evening. But Evelyn could not stop thinking about his eyes. She was 38 years old, and she had not built Carrington Technologies by being sentimental. The company had started in a 1-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn 11 years ago, her own capital, her own architecture, her own 18-hour days, and now occupied 12 floors of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan and employed over 3,000 people across 4 countries. She had been on the cover of 3 major business publications in the past 2 years. She had a penthouse on the Upper East Side that had been featured in an architectural magazine, and she had not slept well inside it in longer than she could clearly remember. The penthouse was beautiful in the way that showrooms are beautiful, precise, curated, deliberately impressive, and built for an audience that was never actually present. Evelyn moved through it most evenings, like a guest who had overstayed her welcome in her own home. She ate at the kitchen island while reviewing documents. She answered calls on the terrace with the city spread below her, like something she had already purchased and grown tired of. The loneliness was not something she would have admitted to anyone, because admitting it would have meant acknowledging that all of this, the tower, the cover stories, the gala invitations, had not delivered what she had quietly expected it to deliver when she was 24 and just beginning to understand how much she wanted. She had been engaged once 7 years ago to a man who had seemed to understand her. He had been charming and attentive and deeply interested in her access to capital. She had discovered this in the worst possible way through a conversation she had not been meant to overhear in a restaurant where she had arrived early, and he had not yet noticed her sitting 2 tables away. After that, she had made a decision, not explicitly, not in words she said out loud, but a firm internal rearrangement. Trust was a resource with a cost. She would spend it on contracts, on legal agreements, on verified performance metrics, not on people. The system had worked. The company had grown. She had remained by almost every measurable standard successful, and she stood in her penthouse the night after the gala still in the wine-stained gown, because she had not yet found a reason to change, and thought about a waiter's steady, unfrightened eyes, and felt something she could not immediately name. Liam Foster woke up before 5 the next morning the way he always did. He had a studio apartment in Astoria that cost him more than it should have given its size and the quality of its fixtures. But the neighborhood was quiet, and the building's manager had known him for 3 years and didn't ask too many questions about late rent. He made coffee on a 2-burner stove and stood at the window, while the sky over Queens turned from black to gray, going through the day's logistics. In his head, the early shift at the print shop on Northern Boulevard, the invoice he needed to follow up on from a consulting call 2 weeks ago, the evening shift at the Meridian, that he was increasingly certain he no longer had. He had been right about that. The message from the hotel's staffing coordinator had arrived before 6, brief and impersonal, informing him that his services were no longer required for future events. No explanation given. He read it twice, set his phone face down on the counter, and finished his coffee. He was not angry. He had learned over the past 4 years to reserve his anger for things that were still salvageable. The Meridian shift was gone. Getting angry about it would not change that, and he had other problems that were still in motion and still required his full attention. The problems had started 4 years ago with the kind of speed that still occasionally surprised him when he let himself think about it. He and a partner had spent 6 years building a customer experience consultancy. Real work, good clients, a team of 18 people they were genuinely proud of. Then his wife Diane had been diagnosed, and then she had been gone in 14 months, and during those 14 months, Liam had done what any person who loved someone would do. He had been present. He had let the business slip. His partner had made decisions that Liam had not been in a position to monitor. And when Liam finally surfaced from the worst of his grief, the company's accounts told a story that required a lawyer and a liquidation specialist to properly interpret. He had paid what he owed and started over, and that was simply the shape of his life now. He did not talk about Diane often. He did not talk about the company often either. He found that people responded to these two facts in ways that were mostly unhelpful, either with the specific kind of pity that made him feel reduced, or with the forced admiration that made him feel like a symbol rather than a person. He preferred to simply exist in whatever room he was in and do whatever work was in front of him and not require much from anyone. It was a system that had served him reasonably well, until a woman with a microphone had asked him a question in front of 400 people, and he had answered it, and now apparently he was unemployed again. 1 week after the gala, Evelyn slipped out of a media appearance early and ducked into a coffee shop on West 46th Street that she had never been in before. Small, warm, smelling of dark roast and cardamom, the kind of place that had probably been there for 20 years and would likely be gone in 5. She ordered at the counter and took a corner table with her back to the wall, the way she always sat when she needed to think without being approached. She had a problem. She had, in fact, several problems, but the one sitting at the center of all the others was this: 3 of her senior vice presidents had resigned in the past 6 weeks. The departures had been framed professionally in their resignation letters. New opportunities, personal priorities. But Evelyn's head of HR had been honest with her in the way that only people who have decided they have nothing left to lose are honest. The word being used internally, across multiple departments, and in multiple conversations was the same word: unreachable. Her people did not feel seen by her. Her best people were leaving because the compensation was excellent, and the culture had become in the precise language of one exit interview. Like working for a very efficient machine that does not know you are there. The timing was catastrophic. Carrington Technologies was 3 months from closing the largest international expansion deal in its history, a partnership that would open markets across 7 European countries and increase revenue by a projected 40% in the first year alone. The deal required demonstrating organizational stability. Demonstrating organizational stability required having an organization that was not quietly hemorrhaging its senior leadership. Every week that passed without resolution moved the needle in the wrong direction, and Evelyn had spent the past month cycling through solutions that addressed the surface of the problem without touching its root. Evelyn was on her second cup of coffee and her 4th page of notes when she looked up and saw Liam Foster behind the counter running the espresso machine with the same unhurried competence with which he had carried a tray through a ballroom full of the most powerful people in New York. She did not look away quickly enough. He noticed her. There was a brief recognition in his face, not hostility, which she had half expected, and not the flattened professional courtesies of someone who has decided to pretend a thing did not happen. He looked at her the way someone looks at a person they have unfinished business with, and then he finished the drink he was making and slid it across the counter to its owner. And when his shift allowed a short break, he came and stood at the edge of her table. "I didn't realize you knew this neighborhood," Liam said. "I don't," Evelyn said. "I was avoiding somewhere else." He nodded as if this were a completely satisfying answer. She found herself irritated by how unsurprised he seemed, not just by her presence, but by her in general, as though he had already assessed her and reached conclusions that did not require updating. "You were co-founder of a consultancy," she said. "Customer experience." Before, something shifted in his expression, not defensiveness, but a careful attention, like someone deciding how much of a conversation they actually want to have. "You looked me up." "My assistant looked you up," Evelyn said, "after the gala." She did not add that she had read the results 3 times. "Then you know how that story ended," Liam said. "I know how the company ended," she said. "That's not the same thing." She watched him consider this. Outside the window, a delivery truck rumbled past, and the coffee shop's pendant lights swayed slightly in some interior draft. Evelyn put her pen down on the table and said without inflection, "I have a problem that I don't know how to solve with money, which is the only category of problem I have historically found interesting. I need someone who understands how people work, not theoretically, actually." Liam looked at her for a long moment. "You're offering me a job." "I'm offering you a conversation," Evelyn said. "The job depends on the conversation." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and for the next 40 minutes, Evelyn Carrington talked about her company in ways she had not talked about it to anyone. Not her board, not her legal team, not the executive coach she had hired and fired within 3 months because the woman kept asking her how she felt about things. She talked about the resignations. She talked about the expansion deal. She talked about the exit interview language that had lodged itself in her brain like a splinter. Liam listened without performing attention. No nodding at intervals, no careful neutral expressions. He simply listened, and when she was finished, he said, "Your people don't think you know they're there. That's what the exit interviews said." "That's not an HR problem," Liam said. "That's a translation problem. You understand the business perfectly. You just don't speak the language that makes people feel like the business belongs to them, too." Evelyn said nothing. "It's fixable," he added, "but not with a consultant who's never worked a job where someone could look through you like glass and not feel a thing." She hired him the following Monday. She told herself it was a calculated risk. She told herself it was a temporary arrangement with a clearly defined scope and measurable outcomes. She drove home that evening through the gray Manhattan streets and did not examine too closely the specific quality of relief she felt, not at having solved the problem, but at the prospect of being in a room again with someone who had looked at her and not looked away. The title they gave him was Temporary Advisory Consultant Customer Experience Division. It was a title that had been designed by committee to sound important enough to justify his presence without granting him any real authority. Liam understood this immediately. He accepted it without comment, took the temporary badge the receptionist printed for him on his first morning, and went to work. The executive floor of Carrington Technologies occupied the 41st and 42nd levels of the Midtown Tower, and it operated with the specific pressurized efficiency of a place where everyone understood that the margin for error was very small. People moved quickly in the corridors. Conversations were clipped and purposeful. The glass walls of the conference rooms meant that every meeting was visible to anyone walking past, which Liam suspected was intentional, a constant reminder that performance was always being observed. He spent his first week doing almost nothing except walking the floors, eating lunch in the staff cafeteria, and asking low-level employees questions that had nothing to do with strategy. He asked about their commutes. He asked which internal systems they found frustrating to use. He asked what they wished someone at the top of the building understood about the bottom of it. The answers were more consistent than he had expected and more useful. People did not describe a broken company. They described a company that ran well and felt like nothing efficient and impersonal, a place where good work disappeared into the machine without acknowledgement, where the distance between a junior analyst and the CEO felt less like hierarchy and more like atmosphere. You couldn't see it. You just felt it pressing down on you every day until you stopped expecting it to lift. The board did not bother to hide their opinion of him. In his first joint meeting with the senior leadership team, a man named Richard Holloway, silver-haired 60-something with the particular ease of someone who has held power long enough to stop pretending he needs to earn it, looked at Liam's temporary badge and then at Liam's face, and said with a pleasant smile, "Remind me again what your most recent position was before this." "Hospitality," Liam said. Richard let the words sit in the room for a moment, then turned back to his documents. Around the table, 2 other board members exchanged a look that they did not bother to make subtle. Evelyn at the head of the table said nothing. She had warned Liam before the meeting that she would not be defending his credentials publicly. It would undermine the authority she needed him to operate under. He had told her he didn't need her to. She had seemed both relieved and faintly guilty about being relieved, which he found more interesting than the board's contempt. Richard did not let it go after that single exchange. Over the following 2 weeks, he asked questions in meetings that were technically about the advisory project, but were structured to highlight Liam's gaps, his lack of formal credentials, his distance from current industry practice, the absence of recent case studies that could be cited and verified. The questions were always polite, they were always precise, and they were always asked in front of an audience, which Liam understood was the point. Outside the executive floor, the rumors moved faster than any internal memo. By the end of his second week, Liam had heard 3 separate versions of the same story, that Evelyn had lost her judgment, that the waiter from the charity gala was now somehow running customer strategy, that the expansion deal was going to collapse under the weight of her latest eccentricity. He heard these things from people who did not know who he was, standing in elevator banks and waiting for the coffee machine on the 23rd floor, and he noted them the way he noted everything without reaction, without urgency, filing each piece of information into a picture that was becoming gradually clearer. The clearest thing in the picture was Evelyn herself. She ran every meeting from a position of complete and defended authority. When she spoke, her logic was immaculate, structured, evidence-based, several steps ahead of whoever she was addressing. Her staff did not challenge her, and not only because she was their employer. They didn't challenge her because she was almost always right, and being right had over years calcified into a posture that made the space around her ideas feel closed. There was no visible entry point for disagreement. There was no signal that alternative thinking was welcome. Her intelligence had become, without her realizing it, a form of isolation. Liam raised this with her directly during their third working session in her office on the 42nd floor. He had presented a summary of what he had gathered from the staff interviews patterns in the language people used the specific moments in company processes where employees felt invisible. Evelyn had read through it in 4 minutes and immediately begun reframing the findings as operational problems with operational solutions. He watched her do it and said, "You're solving the wrong version of the problem." Evelyn looked up from the document. "Explain that." "You read this as a systems issue," Liam said. "Broken processes, inefficient communication channels. Fix the system, fix the problem. But the language your people used isn't the language of process frustration. It's the language of people who don't think anyone above them is actually listening." He watched her face stay controlled and said more quietly, "There's a difference between a workplace where things work and a workplace where people feel like they matter. You've built the first one. You don't have the second." The office was quiet for long enough that the ambient sound of the city 42 floors below became briefly audible. Evelyn set the document down on her desk with great precision, as though placing it incorrectly might cost her something. "What would you suggest?" she said. "Stop presenting decisions after they've already been made," Liam said. "Invite the input before, even when you've already decided, and you usually have the act of asking changes what people think you think of them." She didn't agree immediately. She didn't agree for another 3 days, during which she reviewed the proposal twice, and had her chief of staff run a quiet analysis on team engagement scores across departments. But she implemented it, and the change in the rooms was immediate enough that even people who had been planning to leave began to reconsider their timelines. Liam watched Evelyn adjust, and in adjusting become more visible to her own people, and it seemed to herself. She was not comfortable with the new approach. Asking for input before decisions cost her something that had no clean name, but was related to the specific security that comes from being the only person in a room who has already thought everything through. She was working against her own architecture, and she did it anyway. And Liam respected that more than he had expected to. He also noticed with the same even attention he applied to everything that she had started staying later in the evenings. Not to work, she had always worked late. But in the past 2 weeks, she had twice appeared in the doorway of whatever conference room he was still occupying at 8 or 9 in the evening, coffee in hand, and found reasons to continue conversations that had technically concluded hours earlier. He did not comment on this. He simply stayed and talked about the company, about the data, about what he was observing in the team, and she listened in a way she clearly did not listen to very many people with her full attention, and without the constant forward lean of someone who is already composing their response. He was starting to understand that Evelyn Carrington had not had a real conversation in a very long time. Not a conversation where the other person was not angling for something, or managing her, or performing competence for her benefit. She had surrounded herself entirely with people who needed things from her, and the accumulated weight of that of being perpetually needed, but never simply known, had shaped her into someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be in a room where the stakes were low enough to be honest. The crisis arrived the way crises always arrive, not suddenly, but all at once. A business publication ran a feature story on Carrington Technologies, timed to the rumored expansion deal, and the story was not about the deal. It was about a restructuring event from 4 years ago in the early months of the pandemic, when Evelyn had eliminated 312 positions in a single quarter. The layoffs were not new information. They had been reported at the time, but the story reframed them through a series of interviews with former employees, and the framing was devastating. Words like ruthless and calculated appeared in the first paragraph. A former mid-level manager described the day she received her termination notice while her team was in the middle of a product launch. The internet received the story with the specific enthusiasm it reserves for confirming what it already believed about powerful women. The company's stock dropped 7% in 2 days. 2 of the remaining institutional investors requested emergency calls with the board. A petition circulated online demanding that Evelyn step down as CEO, and it gathered 40,000 signatures in 72 hours, which was not enough to force anything, but was more than enough to make every conversation in the building feel like it was happening at the edge of something that could give way. Evelyn absorbed the coverage with a stillness that Liam recognized by now as a defense mechanism rather than composure. He found her in her office late on the second evening of the news cycle, the city dark and glittering behind the floor-to-ceiling windows, a single lamp on at her desk, reading what appeared to be the same document she had been reading when he had walked past her office 2 hours earlier. "You're not going to say anything," she said without looking up. "I'm waiting to see which version of the story you're going to tell me," Liam said. She set the document down. The restructuring was necessary. The company would not exist without it. Every analysis supported the decision. "I know," Liam said. He sat down across from her. "That's not what I'm asking about." The silence that followed was different from the careful professional silences she usually deployed. This one had a texture to it, something underneath it that was working its way up. "I used $2.3 million of my own money to extend severance packages," Evelyn said finally. "For 119 of the 312, the ones with the longest tenure, the ones who were closest to pension eligibility." She said it the way someone states a fact in a legal document, precise without emphasis, scrubbed of anything that might look like feeling. "No one knows that. I didn't report it. I paid it as a personal transaction through a separate account." Liam looked at her steadily. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because telling people you did something decent is how you tell them you needed to," Evelyn said. "It's an advertisement for a weakness. I don't advertise weaknesses." Something settled in Liam's understanding of her, a piece moving into a position that made the whole picture finally coherent. She had not become cold because she didn't care. She had become cold because she had learned somewhere early and somewhere painful that caring visibly was the same as handing someone a weapon. The business logic of her personality was not logic at all. It was scar tissue. "The people attacking you right now," Liam said carefully, "are attacking a version of you that isn't complete, and you're the only one who can complete it." Evelyn looked at him across the desk, and for a moment, the careful management of her expression was simply gone. Not replaced by anything dramatic, but by something quieter and older. The face of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has briefly stopped pretending it isn't heavy. "I've been afraid of being poor again," she said. It came out evenly, as though she had practiced saying it, but her hands on the desk were very still in the way that hands are still when the rest of the body is working hard. Not in the financial sense, afraid of being without leverage, without the ability to protect myself. I built all of this to never feel like I couldn't afford to walk away from something that was hurting me. She looked at the dark window. Somewhere along the way, I stopped knowing the difference between protection and isolation. Liam said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's the most honest thing you've said since you hired me." The corner of her mouth moved just slightly. "Don't push it, Foster." He left her office that night with the particular feeling of standing near something that had been closed for a long time and was beginning very slowly and very carefully to open. It was a fragile thing. He had seen fragile things before, and he knew how easily the wrong move could close them again. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby, and thought about what it cost a person to say out loud the thing that had been running their life in silence for a decade, and felt, for the first time since he had accepted Evelyn Carrington's reluctant job offer, something that was close to hope. He should have recognized it as the moment just before everything broke. Richard Holloway had been on the board of Carrington Technologies for 6 years, and in that time, he had learned one thing about Evelyn Carrington that she did not know she was teaching him. She was most vulnerable when she believed she was most protected. The media crisis had created an opening he had been patient enough to wait for, and he was not the kind of man who let openings close unused. He started with Liam. The story appeared on a financial news blog, first the kind of outlet that existed primarily to move information that more careful publications wouldn't touch without additional sourcing. It ran under a headline that described Liam as a disgraced former executive and outlined in selective and technically accurate detail the collapse of his consultancy 4 years ago. The bankruptcy filing, the civil suit from a former vendor which had been settled out of court and was a matter of public record. The gap between his last professional role and his current one, which the story characterized as a period of sustained failure. By the following morning, 3 larger outlets had picked up the story, and by afternoon, it had found its way into the comment sections of every article still running about Evelyn's restructuring, where it was being used as evidence that she had lost her ability to make sound judgments about people. Liam read the coverage on his phone during his lunch break, sitting on a bench outside the Midtown Tower. He read it carefully, the way he read most things, without rushing, without the particular anxiety that comes from hoping the words will say something different the second time through. The facts in the story were not wrong. They were simply arranged to mean something they didn't mean, which was a different problem, and one he had less power to correct. Inside the building, the pressure had shifted in ways that were becoming structural. 2 institutional investors, who had previously been neutral on the expansion deal, were now conditioning their continued support on what they called demonstrated leadership stability, which was a phrase that translated plainly meant they wanted Liam gone. Richard had requested an emergency board session for the end of the week. 3 of the 7 board members had already indicated, in conversations that Richard had made sure Evelyn's chief of staff would hear about and report, that they were prepared to call a formal vote on executive leadership if the current situation continued to deteriorate. Evelyn's legal team had advised her to say nothing publicly about Liam, neither to defend him nor to distance herself on the grounds that any statement would extend the news cycle. Her communications director had advised the same thing for different reasons. Her head of investor relations had sent a memo recommending that the advisory engagement be quietly concluded before the board session framed as a natural end of a short-term project. With no admission that external pressure had accelerated the timeline, the memo sat on her desk. She had not responded to it. She read it again on Thursday morning and thought about the $2.3 million sitting in a private account ledger that no one had ever asked about, and thought about what Liam had said, that the people attacking her were attacking an incomplete version of her, and then she closed the memo and went to her next meeting and didn't make a decision. Liam was not unaware of what was happening. He had built a career before everything fell apart on understanding how organizations moved, how information traveled, how power consolidated, how decisions that were presented as strategic were often personal. He recognized Richard Holloway's fingerprints on the timing of the coverage without needing confirmation. He also recognized with the same clear-eyed accuracy that Evelyn was in a position where the cost of standing beside him was real and measurable, and the cost of letting him go was something softer and harder to quantify. He did not pressure her. He did not ask her what she was going to do. He came to work on Thursday morning, completed the client experience framework document he had been building for 3 weeks, left it in her shared drive with a brief note that it was ready for implementation whether or not he was present to support it, and went about the rest of his day with the same even efficiency he had brought to every other day. He thought about Diane sometimes in moments like this, not with grief anymore, or not only with grief, but with the specific quality of missing someone whose presence had made him better at being himself. Diane had always said that his greatest flaw was his willingness to make things easy for people who were in the process of letting him down. He had never entirely agreed with her assessment, but standing in an elevator in a glass tower in Midtown, watching the floor numbers descend, he allowed that she might have had a point. The press conference had been Evelyn's communications director's idea, and Evelyn had agreed to it because the alternative silence while the board session approached felt like surrender. It was scheduled for Friday afternoon in a hotel media room 2 blocks from the tower, and its stated purpose was to address the restructuring coverage and outline the company's path forward on the expansion deal. Liam's name was not in the prepared statement. Evelyn had reviewed the statement twice and not added it. The room held 40 journalists and twice as many cameras. Evelyn stood at the podium in a gray suit that she had chosen because it read as serious without reading as defensive, and she delivered the prepared statement cleanly and without visible effort. She talked about the restructuring in the careful, legally vetted language her team had approved. She talked about the expansion deal in the forward-looking, confidence-projecting language that investor relations had provided. She was, by every technical measure, performing well. Then a journalist in the third row asked about Liam Foster. The question was framed as a concern about judgment, whether Evelyn stood behind the decision to bring in a consultant with a documented history of professional failure, given the current climate around the company's leadership. It was not an unfair question exactly. It was the question that Richard had ensured would be asked through channels that Evelyn would only fully understand later. Evelyn looked at the journalist. The prepared statement had no answer for this question, and her communications director standing at the side of the room gave her the small, nearly imperceptible nod that they had agreed would mean, stay on message, don't expand. She stayed on message. She said that all advisory engagements were evaluated on outcomes and that the current engagement had produced measurable improvements in internal team alignment. She said it in the flat, precise language of a person who is not lying, but is also not telling the truth. And then she moved to the next question, and the press conference continued, and Liam Foster's name was not mentioned again. He had watched it on the live stream from the conference room on the 38th floor, sitting alone at the long table with his laptop open, and the client experience document still pulled up in another tab. He watched Evelyn answer the question about him. He watched her face perform the careful neutrality of someone choosing silence, and he understood it. He understood the calculation, understood the pressure she was under, understood that she had not said anything cruel or false. She had simply not said anything real. He closed the laptop. He gathered the few items he kept at the temporary desk. They had assigned him a notepad, a charger, a paperback he had been reading during lunch. He left his temporary badge on the desk rather than returning it to reception, because returning it would have required a conversation he did not have the energy for. He took the elevator down to the lobby and walked out into the late afternoon of a Friday in October, the air cold and bright and carrying that specific New York smell of exhaust and something faintly metallic, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment and simply breathed. He was not angry at her. This was not generosity on his part, it was accuracy. He understood why she had made the choice she made, and understanding it did not make it hurt less, but it made it clean. There was no betrayal in what she had done, because betrayal required a promise, and Evelyn Carrington had never promised him anything except a temporary badge and a measurable scope of work. What he felt standing on the sidewalk with his paperback under his arm was something quieter and more total than anger. It was the feeling of having been once again the person in the room who could see clearly and could not make that clarity matter. The 48 hours that followed Liam's departure moved through the company like a change in atmospheric pressure, perceptible, unsettling, difficult to attribute to any single cause. 3 members of the customer experience team sent internal messages asking about the status of the advisory engagement. 2 of them, within 24 hours of receiving no clear response, submitted preliminary resignation notices. The head of product development, who had been quietly enthusiastic about the new team alignment protocols Liam had introduced, sent Evelyn's chief of staff a single-line email that read, "If this is how we treat people who actually help us, I need to reconsider my own position here." Richard called the board session for Monday morning. Evelyn spent the weekend in her penthouse. She reviewed documents. She answered emails. She stood on the terrace on Saturday evening and looked at the city and tried to reconstruct the logic of her Friday decision in a way that still made sense, and found that the logic was sound and the conclusion was wrong, and that these two things could both be true simultaneously, and the second one was still what she had to live with. She had chosen the empire over the person. She had done it with her eyes open and her reasoning intact, and every cost correctly calculated. And she had still gotten it wrong, because some costs do not appear in the calculation until after the decision has been made, and the room is quiet, and you are standing in your penthouse on a Saturday night, thinking about a man who had looked at you from a distance of 400 people and not looked away. Sunday night, she sat at her kitchen island with a glass of water. She wasn't drinking, and thought about what Liam had said to her in the office the night she had told him about the severance payments. She had told him the thing she had never told anyone, and he had not used it. He had not leaned into it, had not made her feel exposed for having said. It had not filed it away with the particular attentiveness of someone collecting leverage. He had simply received it and moved forward, as though the honesty of another person was not a weapon, but a door. She had spent 11 years building walls against people who might walk through doors. She had gotten very good at it. She sat at the kitchen island and looked at her glass of water and admitted to herself quietly and without drama that she had just defended those walls against the only person in recent memory who had not been trying to get past them at all. Monday morning, Richard's board session opened at 9. Evelyn was not in the building. Her chair at the head of the table was empty, and her chief of staff had sent a single message to the board administrator. At 8:57, Ms. Carrington will be slightly delayed. Please proceed with preliminary items. She was in Astoria. The restaurant where Liam was working that Monday morning was a Greek diner on 31st Street in Astoria, the kind of place that had been open since the 1980s and showed no signs of reconsidering its decor. He was refilling coffee at the counter when Evelyn walked in. She was wearing a dark coat and no makeup, and she looked for the first time since he had known her like a person rather than a performance. She sat down at the counter. He poured her a coffee without being asked. "I watched the live stream," she said. "I saw your face when I answered that question." "I know you did what you thought you had to do," Liam said. "That's not the same as it being right," Evelyn said. She wrapped both hands around the mug. The diner was nearly empty at that hour. A man reading a newspaper at the far end of the counter, 2 people in a booth near the window. "I've been making decisions that way my entire career. Find the defensible choice, execute it cleanly. Don't leave anything that can be used against you." She looked at the coffee. "I'm very good at it, and I'm very tired of it." Liam said nothing. He had learned with Evelyn that the most useful thing he could do when she was finally saying something true was to not interrupt it. "I told you something in my office that I have never said to another person," she said. "About the fear, about why I built all of this, and you just sat with it. You didn't file it. You didn't use it." Her voice stayed even, but something in it had changed the way a frequency changes when the source gets closer. "I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't. But I know that I stood at a podium and chose the version of myself that I built to survive, instead of the one I've been trying to become. And I'm done doing that." Liam looked at her across the counter for a long moment. Then he said, "People don't heal when they feel superior. They heal when they finally feel understood." Evelyn met his eyes. "I'm starting to understand that." She arrived at the board session 40 minutes late, which was long enough for Richard to have framed the narrative, and short enough that the vote had not yet been called. She walked in without apology, set her bag on the table, and remained standing. She told the board about the $2.3 million. She presented the transaction record she had pulled from the private account over the weekend documentation that had never been filed, never been reported, never been used. She told them what Liam had built during his 6 weeks at the company, the framework document, the engagement data, the specific retention impact, that could be measured in the two departments where his protocols had been fully implemented. She laid it all out in the precise evidence-based language she had always used, except that this time, the evidence included her own culpability, her own silence, and her own decision to choose self-protection over transparency for 11 years. Then she looked at Richard Holloway and said with the same calm she had used in the ballroom of the Meridian 11 weeks ago, "I know what you did. I know which journalist received which call and from which number. My legal team has been reviewing the communication records since Thursday." Richard's expression did not change, but something behind it did the same involuntary movement she had seen in her own face, in the mirror, for years. 3 board members who had been aligned with Richard asked for a recess. By the end of the day, 2 of them had reversed their positions. Richard's financial conduct across several transactions involving the company's vendor contracts was referred for independent audit. He resigned before the audit concluded. The expansion deal closed 8 weeks later. The coverage when it came focused primarily on the severance story, the $2.3 million, the private account, the 119 people who had received extended packages without ever knowing where the money had come from. Several of them gave interviews. Their language was different from the language of the petition that had gathered 40,000 signatures. It was quieter and more specific, the language of people describing something they hadn't expected. Evelyn read the coverage and did not feel vindicated. She felt more than anything the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding a position for a very long time and has finally put it down. 4 months after the board session, Carrington Technologies held its annual staff gathering. It was not a gala. It was a dinner in a rented event space in Brooklyn. Round tables, decent food, no dress code enforced. Evelyn had proposed it. Her team had been surprised and then quietly, visibly relieved. Liam was there. Not as a consultant that engagement had formally concluded, but because Evelyn had called him 3 weeks after the board session and asked if he would consider a permanent advisory role, and he had said he would think about it, and he had thought about it for 2 weeks, and then he had said yes. Near the end of the evening, Evelyn found him near one of the side tables, helping a new hire figure out where the extra chairs had been stored. It was an entirely unnecessary thing for him to be doing. It was also, she had come to understand exactly the kind of thing he always did. Small, practical, unremarkable acts of usefulness that he performed without requiring them to mean anything. She walked over and handed him a glass of wine. He took it. She kept her own. Turns out, Evelyn said, "I had a lot to learn." Liam looked at her with the same expression he had worn in the ballroom of the Meridian, 400 people watching the silence just beginning to stretch. Steady, unfrightened, present in a way that most people in her experience were not. "Most people do, he said. "They just don't usually ask." The evening continued around them. Across the room, people who had spent years working in a glass tower that did not know they were there were laughing with each other in a rented space in Brooklyn, and the sound of it was real and unmanaged and completely ordinary. And it was by every measure that had ever actually mattered enough.